This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Czech Chris, London, UK. Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Chapter 3. Mr. Ralph Nickleby receives sad tidings of his brother, but bears up nobly against the intelligence communicated to him. The reader is informed how he liked Nicholas, who is herein introduced, and how kindly he proposed to make his fortune at once. Having rendered his zealous assistance towards dispatching the lunch, with all that promptitude and energy which are among the most important qualities that men of business can possess, Mr. Ralph Nickleby took a cordial farewell of his fellow speculators, and bent his steps westward in unwonted good humour. As he passed St. Paul's, he stepped aside into a doorway to set his watch, and with his hand on the key and his eye on the cathedral dial, was intent upon so doing when a man suddenly stopped before him. It was Newman Noggs. "Ah, Newman," said Mr. Nickleby, looking up as he pursued his occupation. "The letter about the mortgage has come, has it? I thought it would." "Wrong," replied Newman. "What! And nobody called respecting it?" inquired Mr. Nickleby, pausing. Noggs shook his head. "What has come, then?" inquired Mr. Nickleby. "I have," said Newman. "What else?" demanded the master, sternly. "This," said Newman, drawing a sealed letter slowly from his pocket. "Postmark, Strand, black wax, black border, woman's hand, C.N. in the corner." "Black wax," said Mr. Nickleby, glancing at the letter. "I know something of that hand, too. Newman, I shouldn't be surprised if my brother were dead." "I don't think you would," said Newman, quietly. "Why not, sir?" demanded Mr. Nickleby. "You never are surprised," replied Newman. "That's all." Mr. Nickleby snatched the letter from his assistant, and, fixing a cold look upon him, opened, read it, put it in his pocket, and, having now hit the time to a second, began winding up his watch. "It's as I expected, Newman," said Mr. Nickleby, while he was thus engaged. "He IS dead. Dear me. Well, that's a sudden thing. I shouldn't have thought it, really." With these touching expressions of sorrow, Mr. Nickleby replaced his watch in his fob, and fitting on his gloves to a nicety, turned upon his way, and walked slowly westward, with his hands behind him. "Children alive?" inquired Noggs, stepping up to him. "Why, that's the very thing," replied Mr. Nickleby, as though his thoughts were about them at that moment. "They are both alive." "Both?" repeated Newman Noggs in a low voice. "And the widow too," added Mr. Nickleby, "and all three in London, confound them. All three here, Newman." Newman fell a little behind his master, and his face was curiously twisted as by a spasm, but whether of paralysis, or grief, or inward laughter, nobody but himself could possibly explain. The expression of a man's face is commonly a help to his thoughts, or glossary on his speech, but the countenance of Newman Noggs in his ordinary moods was a problem which no stretch of ingenuity could solve. "Go home," said Mr. Nickleby, after they had walked a few paces, looking round at the clerk as if he were his dog. The words were scarcely uttered when Newman darted across the road, slunk among the crowd, and disappeared in an instant. "Reasonable, certainly," muttered Mr. Nickleby to himself as he walked on. "Very reasonable. My brother never did anything for me, and I never expected it. The breath is no sooner out of his body than I am to be looked to as the support of a great hearty woman and a grown boy and girl. What are they to me? I never saw them." Full of these and many other reflections of a similar kind, Mr. Nickleby made the best of his way to the Strand, and referring to his letter as if to ascertain the number of the house he wanted, stopped at a private door about half way down that crowded thoroughfare. A miniature painter lived there, for there was a large gilt frame screwed upon the street door, in which were displayed upon a black velvet ground two portraits of naval dress coats with faces looking out of them, and telescopes attached. One of a young gentleman in a very vermilion uniform, flourishing a sabre, and one of a literary character with a high forehead, a pen and ink, 6 books, and a curtain. There was, moreover, a touching representation of a young lady reading a manuscript in an unfathomable forest, and a charming whole length of a large-headed little boy sitting on a stool with his legs foreshortened to the size of salt-spoons. Besides these works of art, there were a great many heads of old ladies and gentlemen smirking at each other out of blue and brown skies, and an elegantly written card of terms with an embossed border. Mr. Nickleby glanced at these frivolities with great contempt, and gave a double knock, which, having been thrice repeated, was answered by a servant girl with an uncommonly dirty face. "Is Mrs. Nickleby at home, girl?" demanded Ralph, sharply. "Her name ain't Nickleby," said the girl. "Lacreevy, you mean." Mr. Nickleby looked very indignant at the handmaid on being thus corrected, and demanded with much asperity what she meant, which she was about to state when a female voice proceeding from a perpendicular staircase at the end of the passage inquired who was wanted. "Mrs. Nickleby," said Ralph. "It's the second floor, Hannah," said the same voice. "What a stupid thing you are! Is the second floor at home?" "Somebody went out just now, but I think it was the attic, which had been a cleaning of himself," replied the girl. "You had better see," said the invisible female. "Show the gentleman where the bell is, and tell him he mustn't knock double knocks for the second floor. I can't allow a knock, except when the bell's broke, and then it must be two single ones." "Here," said Ralph, walking in without more parley. "I beg your pardon, is that Mrs. what's her name?" "Creevy, Lacreevy," replied the voice, as a yellow headdress bobbed over the banisters. "I'll speak to you a moment, ma'am, with your leave," said Ralph. The voice replied that the gentleman was to walk up, but he had walked up before it spoke, and stepping into the first floor, was received by the wearer of the yellow headdress, who had a gown to correspond, and was of much the same colour herself. Miss La Creevy was a mincing young lady of 50, and Miss La Creevy's apartment was the gilt frame downstairs on a larger scale and something dirtier. "Ahem!" said Miss La Creevy, coughing delicately behind her black silk mitten. "A miniature, I presume. A very strongly marked countenance for the purpose, sir. Have you ever sat before?" "You mistake my purpose, I see, ma'am," replied Mr. Nickleby, in his usual blunt fashion. "I have no money to throw away on miniatures, ma'am, and nobody to give one to, thank God, if I had. Seeing you on the stairs, I wanted to ask a question of you about some lodgers here." Miss La Creevy coughed once more. This cough was to conceal her disappointment, and said, "Oh, indeed." "I infer from what you said to your servant that the floor above belongs to you, ma'am," said Mr. Nickleby. Yes, it did, Miss La Creevy replied. The upper part of the house belonged to her, and as she had no necessity for the second floor rooms just then, she was in the habit of letting them. Indeed, there was a lady from the country and her 2 children in them at that present speaking. "A widow, ma'am?" said Ralph. "Yes, she is a widow," replied the lady. "A poor widow, ma'am?" said Ralph, with a powerful emphasis on that little adjective which conveys so much. "Well, I'm afraid she is poor," rejoined Miss La Creevy. "I happen to know that she is, ma'am," said Ralph. "Now, what business has a poor widow in such a house as this, ma'am?" "Very true," replied Miss La Creevy, not at all displeased with this implied compliment to the apartments. "Exceedingly true." "I know her circumstances intimately, ma'am," said Ralph. "In fact, I'm a relation of the family, and I should recommend you not to keep them here, ma'am." "I should hope, if there was any incompatibility to meet the pecuniary obligations," said Miss La Creevy with another cough, "that the lady's family would—" "No, they wouldn't, ma'am," interrupted Ralph hastily. "Don't think it." "If I am to understand that," said Miss La Creevy, "the case wears a very different appearance." "You may understand it then, ma'am," said Ralph, "and make your arrangements accordingly. I am the family, ma'am. At least, I believe I'm the only relation they have, and I think it right that you should know I can't support them in their extravagances. How long have they taken these lodgings for?" "Only from week to week," replied Miss La Creevy. "Mrs. Nickleby paid the first week in advance." "Then you had better get them out at the end of it," said Ralph. They can't do better than go back to the country,